start by talking just a little bit about the Office of the Chief Economist. There's a number of really great staff people here, a number of really great staff people not here. Maybe you could raise your hand if you're from the Office of Chief Economist. So there's about 20 total economists. We're housed in the Economics and Statistics Administration, but we're the Office of the Chief Economist for the entire department. And so we have a role of working with other departments, either with their economists if they have them, or not if they don't have them. So we have projects ongoing with EDA, with NTIA. We have some outside the department, so one with the Department of Homeland Security. And the idea here is to basically help bringing economic expertise where useful. And so this project was done with a lot of cooperation with NIST, particularly the Manufacturing Extension Program. And I'm really grateful to Phil Singerman and his team, Mark Schmidt, Mark Tropy, Ken Wojtek, others I'm forgetting, Dave Steeren, who've been really helpful as well. So to dive into supply chains, what I want to talk about is kind of why do we need to reinvest in supply chains, but then step back a tiny bit and talk about what is a supply chain, and then how government can help, and then the role of the Department of Commerce, which has already been and I think will continue to be very important in this arena, and then particularly some stuff that my office is doing. And we'll close with a really cool demo of a tool on cost of lead time that helps, I think, optimize supply chains that Ryan Noonan will lead. So just to think, what is a supply chain? This term is used in two ways that are slightly different. So there's a broader meaning that just means the linkages between firms that work together to take a particular product from idea to production to market. There's also a narrower meaning, which is logistics. How do we move the products? So we can think of this kind of as making it and moving it. And most of what I'm going to talk about, most of this initiative that we're working on with the White House is about making it, but have some things to say at the end about moving it, which is also a really important role for commerce generally. So why do we even talk about supply chains at all? A lot of it is that there's been these structural changes in US manufacturing. Large corporations used to do a lot of activities in-house, and instead we now have a shared supply chain, often global, where there's parts suppliers, R&D institutions, and assemblers that all come together. There's a benefit of this, which is you get access to specialized suppliers. So if you're Ford, you can benefit from a supplier that also supplies to Toyota. This supplier may also supply increasingly to Google, Apple, other areas, other industries as well. But there's a cost. The economists call aspects of this can be characterized as either a free rider problem, a tragedy of the commons. But basically the idea is that an individual firm that invests in making its supplier better isn't going to capture all the returns on their investment in doing that. Some of that's going to go to these competitors and to other industries. So some implications of these changes are that no one company can win by itself, that success depends on really healthy ecosystems of suppliers and other institutions. And that means then there's an increasingly important potential for government to act as a catalyst. And I'm going to highlight 3 ways a government can do that. We can convene, we can prime the pump with small amounts of money, and we can also diffuse information. So one thing, actually, I'm hoping to talk for about maybe 25 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be plenty of time to have questions at the end. So if anything occurs or if something's totally unclear now, please ask. So as I mentioned, the Department of Commerce role can be divided into 2 areas. The making it, and that's, I think, the main initiative here that I want to talk about is this White House Supply Chain Innovation Initiative. And then the second one is moving it, a logistics-focused area. So to talk, and the first part of the talk will be focused on the White House Supply Chain Innovation and the kind of the making it part. This is our report that we just released, the Office of the Chief Economist, joint with the White House. And Ryan and Jessica Nicholson and I were the sort of the DOC authors, and then J.J. Rayner from the White House worked on it as well. So if you think about what supply chains used to look like, we would have a vertically integrated firm that would do all these things, so starting from R&D up through product development, production, packaging, warehousing, and even sometimes selling it in their own company-owned store. What we have now is a far more complicated structure where we have suppliers in tiers. So we see supplier 3 supplies to supplier 1, and then that supplier is the one that supplies directly to large firm 2, but it may also be that this supplier 3 is going to supply directly to large firm 1. So we have this very complicated web and network of suppliers that now characterizes the economy. So in the old days, this is just the extreme example, was the River Rouge in Detroit, where Ford had mines that it owned in Minnesota. The iron ore from those mines would be transported in Ford-owned ships through the Great Lakes to land at the Ford docks at the beginning of the River Rouge factory. Other inputs would be added, and 3 days later, that iron ore would leave the factory in the form of a finished Model T. So that's sort of one extreme. The other extreme, I think it's important to point out, there's some ways that supply chains are really different than perfect competition, which those of you who've studied economics may remember in the dim recesses of the past. But in perfect competition, you have many buyers and sellers of a homogeneous product. Prices are the only information that's shared across firms. And so what these two things give you is that suppliers are pretty substitutable. If you're a bakery and you can't get Farmer Jones's wheat, well, Farmer Smith's wheat is going to be the same. We have grade, standards and grades and whatever. It doesn't matter. You may not even know who supplied your wheat. The modern supply chain is really different from that as well, in that the products are modified for different customers. So even within a customer, so if you think about making a seat for the Ford Taurus, that same seat isn't going to fit in a F-150 truck, let alone in a Toyota. And so there's a benefit to discussion about how to jointly optimize the supplier's equipment and the customer's design. That maybe it's designed, the customer's designed it all in one piece, but the supplier has small equipment, and so if you change it, you can get some efficiencies. Or maybe there's a curve, a very sharp curve in there that's expensive for the supplier to make. The customer may not know that. If there's a technique called value analysis or value engineering that allows a supplier to say to the customer, do you really need that sharp curve? Because if you don't, I can cut the price to you by 5%. So this kind of information about what the design actually looks like is, again, very different from the kind of standard markets that you studied in Econ 101, where Farmer Jones is not generally planning different kinds of wheat depending on the baker. And so all this means then that the firms often incur significant costs of switching suppliers, and conversely, there's really great benefit to collaboration with suppliers. So I want to talk a little bit now about features, sort of move away a little bit from the theory and into features of US supply chains that we see today. And so I want to talk about how they're basically a key input in manufacturing, they're interconnected, they're largely domestic, they made up a lot of small firms, and then there's a potential key role for policy. So I'll go through these pretty quickly. So I think a key thing to notice, we often focus in policy, or if we're thinking about firms, on direct labor costs, the people who actually touch parts, or even the people who are employed by a firm. But in fact, supply chain costs are really a key part. And so just what this chart shows is that materials alone are over half of the total value of a shipment from a manufacturer. So if your final selling price is $1, 54 cents of that is going to be in materials. And then there's another 6 or 8 percentage points that can also be accounted as supply chain costs, so services, contract work, energy. And that contrasts with about 13% for payroll and benefit for all the employees that are directly employed by the firm. So not just the line workers, but also the engineers, the salespeople, et cetera. So it's a really key part. And as one person we interviewed as part of the White House supply chain initiative pointed out that, if you can take, say, a 5% savings in your materials costs, which are half of your total cost, buys you a lot more than the similar 5% savings on labor. You get a lot of R&D money out of, if you can cut 2 percentage points or 5 off of your energy costs, there's a lot of money there. Off of your materials costs, there's a lot of money there for R&D. This percentage that's due to the supply chain is increasing over time. So in 1992, it was about 52%, and this is the full thing, all the supply chain costs, including the contract work and the energy. So 52%, now rising in 2012 to 59%, so an 11% increase over the past couple of decades. I mentioned that these supply chains are interconnected, so that you have often the same company is providing a same input to different firms. And so this is an example from wind turbines. And so you can see that, for example, LM is providing rotor blades to Vestas, Siemens, basically everybody. And you can also see that there's various parts provided by the same people, et cetera. And this is what gives rise to a problem of, whose responsibility is it to increase capability in the supply chain? The second, or the third feature that I wanted to talk about is the highly domestic nature of manufacturing supply chains in the US. And I have to say this was a surprise to me. This was a report that was done by Jessica Nicholson and Ryan Noonan on our OCE staff, looking at through the input-output tables. And what they found was that if a product is made in the US, about 79% of that value comes from the US. So we all think a lot about electronic supply chains like Apple, et cetera, where very little of the value actually comes from the US in the production. That's not the typical case. So what this shows kind of the variation, that food and beverage is really dramatic, a lot made in the US. And more what we might think of is a typical example would be electronics, et cetera. There are also, of course, products that are entirely imported. So if you think about a Toyota that's made in Kentucky, that has on average about 70% of its value coming from the US. There's also Toyotas made in Japan that would have almost 0% of their value made in the US. Another key feature of these supply chains in the US is the important role of small manufacturers. So they make up 98% of manufacturing firms, a smaller percent, 42% of manufacturing employees, and they comprise about 72% of new manufacturing jobs, over the last, I think it's since 2009. And we can sort of see this increasing percent. One problem that we face because we have so many small firms in the supply chain is that these small firms face a lot of barriers to innovation, and this is problematic for supply chains as a whole that want to compete both nationally and internationally. So if we think about 3 stages in the innovation process, small suppliers have problems in each one. So with invention, small firms are 1/7 as likely to conduct R&D as large firms. And so even though there are 98% of manufacturing establishments, they perform only 1/3 of the total R&D. In commercialization, if they do come up with a new product, it's very hard for them to either finance their first factory or get information to customers about, hey, this is something you should adopt. This was a problem that was particularly pointed out by the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, which was an advisory committee that the White House had with Commerce as a major player to advise us on manufacturing policy. And then, so we have problems in invention, commercialization, and then adoption. So the final stage, when an innovation exists, it's out there, could have been invented by a large firm. Small firms also have trouble in adopting these new things. So it's hard for them to adopt the latest in information technology, et cetera. The result is overall, if you control for industry, et cetera, SMEs are about 60% as productive as large firms. So just to kind of give an example from the automotive industry, this is some research I did in my academic life. And we found that a third of auto supply chain employment is in firms with fewer than 500 employees. There's low adoption of proven management innovation. So when we talk about adoption of innovation, it's not necessarily just a piece of equipment, et cetera. It can also be, and it's often very important, a management innovation. Many of these pioneered by Toyota in the 1970s and still not really well diffused in US manufacturing. So one of these innovations is quality circles, where you basically get a variety of employees in a firm together to discuss problems. So it can be engineers, can be line workers, can be marketing people. Each of them have a different perspective. The line worker often has really useful information because they're the ones watching the machine. They're the ones that can say, oh, you know, when it's hot, that machine always has a problem. And that's data that may not be available, or putting those conditions together may not be something that top management or an engineer sees easily. And fewer than half of suppliers have these. Another kind of innovation is preventive maintenance, where you figure out how often, on average, your machines need to be maintained before they break. Then you actually fix them before they break. It saves you a lot of hassle. But only 2/3 do it consistently. And I should say this is a survey, this was self-report. So the reality is probably far lower. A quarter of them have no engineers. And so this weakness is not just a problem for these firms, but it's a problem throughout the supply chain. It hurts the whole auto industry. I think we saw this quite dramatically in the auto rescue, where a lot of these firms were financially weak. And there was this threat of cascading bankruptcy, where one failing would take down others. And this caused then the head of Ford to go and testify before the Senate about why there should be a rescue for his two major competitors, because he was worried that if they went down, his suppliers would go down, and that would take Ford down with them. That was a financial issue. There's also these innovation issues. So I mentioned at the very beginning this technique of value analysis. One example outside of autos is a company called Itron that makes electric meters. They had a new product where they had a terminal that used silver and cadmium. Just to be careful, make sure it worked, they used a ton of silver and cadmium in this little terminal. They worked with the supplier, they worked with their customer to figure out, well, we could actually cut how much we need, because in understanding exactly how that terminal made contact with the rest of the meter was really key. And they saved $1 per part, it was like 20% of the total cost, just from this one information, this interaction across. But yet, only a third, this is now back to autos, only a third of small suppliers actually do this. So to summarize, what we have is, I think, a problem in capability with small suppliers, and then we have weaknesses in collaboration between suppliers and customers. And the question is, why does these problems exist? Why don't markets solve them? And I think there's two kinds of market failures. There's a problem between firms that I mentioned, this free rider problem, that you don't want to strengthen small business that may also serve your competitor. There's another problem, though, which is within firms. And big firms are complicated organizations. One way to simplify is to have silos with separate goals. So you tell purchasing, minimize your piece price. You know, if here's the product we need, If you can bring it in for instead of $1 at 99 cents, that's great. Then you tell finance, we want to see a lot of cash flow. The problem is, and you tell operations, well, we want it smooth, we never want to see a quality problem, we never want to see downtime. These incentives actually clash, right? So one way that purchasing can meet its goal is by getting a low piece price, even if the supplier's quality may threaten the uptime measure of the operations people. Or finance may say, we want you to pay suppliers slowly, in some cases 180 days after they provided the product. That makes their cash flow look good, but it's really stupid overall because these suppliers are borrowing at 14%, and the OEM can borrow at, or the large company can borrow at 2 or 3%. So overall, you're adding costs to the chain that hurt the bottom line. And so it's particularly true in these areas like quality and innovation that are harder to measure than piece price. And so it's again, an issue within firms that's very hard for them to maximize profits. But there are some things that customers can do. And there's 3 practices that we've identified that can help, and we've seen people who do this. And one of our goals in the White House Supply Chain Innovation Initiative is to lift up and to talk about those. So the first one is to offer suppliers some kind of assurance that they're going to get a return on investments that they make. And this could be a long-term contract. It also could be more informal than that. So there's a small company in Wisconsin, just about 1,000 employees, that makes stair lifts for people in wheelchairs, and called Bruno. They were having a problem when these things are used outside that they rust. And so they went to a supplier called AdTech, said if you invest in this technology for painting called eCoat, we believe that we'll provide you the business. We're not going to write a contract that says on which models and how many of what, but we assure you that you will make a return on this investment. So they spent $1 million, a lot of money for a 20-person firm. And they found out that not only did Bruno make good on that promise, but they had capacity on that machine that they could use with other customers as well. And so this is a really great example of the ecosystem that we talk about, because now there's a whole bunch of small companies in Wisconsin supplying a variety of industries, and now this rust-proof paint is available to them in a way that it wasn't before. So Bruno made an investment, they got a return, but they also provided a return to their community. A second example is promoting information sharing and making changes in their own operations as a result of supplier suggestions. So this Itron example that I gave is an example there. And then a third thing is to use a total cost of ownership approach in making purchasing decisions. So try to understand not just what the piece price is that a supplier is going to offer you, but what's the likely impact on warranty, on quality, et cetera. And then even if you can go beyond just the cost of ownership to thinking about the benefits, maybe the supplier is able to provide some innovation, so you're actually paying the supplier more, but the revenue in the bottom line for the whole supply chain may go up. So these are 3 kinds of things that we see out there that some companies are adopting, but not others. So how do we overcome these market failures? There's a couple of different ways, as I mentioned, the diffusing information, pump priming, and convening. And as usual, when I talk about this, I go on too long, so I'm going to go on a little bit quickly. So I mentioned, I guess, these 2 major policies that talk about improving supply chains. So the first one, making it better, so promoting innovation. So that's, and I've talked about this White House Supply Chain Innovation Initiative. There's many others listed here. I wanted to talk really briefly, or actually ask Ryan to talk about our one area that's involved in moving it faster and thinking about how do we improve logistics, how do we think about the way products move and how much it costs to move products. And so, Ryan, if you want to talk about the ACE tool.
Can everybody hear me? All right. So this is the Assess Costs Everywhere tool, also acetool.commerce.gov. If you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do that. The sort of broad goal of this tool is to help businesses or anyone, media, citizens, anyone, to think about the total cost of ownership. And so this ranges, as Sue mentioned, from labor costs, which are fairly easy to understand and calculate, through things like travel to your suppliers in foreign countries, to shipping, whether that's by container or by air freight. And it runs through a whole bunch of things, all the way up through some more abstract things like political and security risks or intellectual property risks, which are much harder to quantify but are extremely important to you if you're a business making products abroad. And so in particular today, we are going to talk about one particular aspect of the ACE tool. And so this is the website live. There's a little snazzy little video here that you can skip through or watch. And then in the inventory section here, this is a relatively new tool that we added to our ACE website last fall in October, I think. And it's here right at the top. It's very easy to get to, the cost of lead time calculator. This was designed by Professor Suzanne de Treville at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She was also a visiting professor at MIT last year. And the insight here that Professor de Treville had is that there are quantifications and sort of concepts in quantitative finance that can be applied to understanding the cost of increasing your lead time if you manufacture something abroad and it takes you longer to get it after you order it. And so the sort of the 2-cent version of that is that, when you order something, you need to make sort of a forecast about how much of that you need. And so if you can get it instantaneously in an ideal world, your customer says, I need 6 units of X, then you just give them 6 units of X. As the timeline increases between when you'll have to make the order and when you'll know how much you need, the sort of uncertainty in that demand forecast increases. And so if you have to order 6 weeks in advance or 6 months in advance, and say you're a clothing store, it's very hard to sort of guess what fashion will be in 6 months. And so the tool here backgrounds a lot of that sort of quantitative finance stuff and asks for 5 inputs from the user. In our experience, businesses who use this are relatively familiar with these. Some of them are very easy and some of them are a little more complicated. There are these little information bubbles on each of these things to sort of provide some help, and you can play around with this yourselves also, but I'll do a real quick demo. And so the first input it asks for is the price that you receive for selling something at the store or to your final customer, depending on what sort of business you are. The make-to-order cost here is this is sort of a very long discussion, but the idea here is how much it makes to get from your shortest lead time supplier. So ideally, that might be a factory down the street, it might be a couple states over, whatever the shortest one is. And so theoretically, that will also be the most expensive. There's a residual value here. This is the sort of the salvage value or the scrap value. If you can't clear something out of your inventory, how much is it worth to you if you don't sell it? This varies a lot across industries, and we found that sort of consumer electronics and apparel have very low residual values. If you can't clear something, you lose a lot of the value. If you're making nuts and bolts, typically not really, because the majority of the value is in the metal that's in the bolt anyway. The next thing is this minimum service level. This is a more complicated thing. Most companies we've found think about this as a fill rate, which is sort of the percent of demand you meet from stock so that you don't have back orders or stock outs. Depending on the size of your company and sort of your market, this can be pretty high. We've seen companies that sort of look to have a 99% fill rate. The sort of input here is at this level, but as you change this, the fill rate here will go up. And so you can kind of back into it if minimum service level is not your preferred way of thinking about it. And again, there's an information bubble, but there's a lot of math here that may not be to your liking. And then this volatility parameter here is a measure of sort of your how much your demand changes over time, what your peaks are going to look like, when they're going to happen. There's a calculator built into the tool with a simple link here. we find that a good way to estimate this is to ask a company sort of what is your peak demand at most, how much extra will you have than you think. So the basic input here that we will just go with is your peaks are 3 times average, and then they will occur once every 10 periods. And that can be changed to whatever your business model would require. And so at the very end, you just add a curve here. And the insight of this curve here is that this is a relative lead time here, and so it's sort of normalized from 0 to 1. You take your longest and your shortest, divide by the longest so that you have a range from 0 to 1. And as you go across this range, the amount of money that you need to save just to make up for this demand volatility, this risk of either having too much or not enough stuff for what your final demand will be, goes up. And in this case, given the values that came in, you would be looking to save about 27%. There we go. You'd be looking to save about 27% at a fully extended supply chain. And as you get closer, of course, that number goes down. If you can get it, at sort of 10% of the longest possible supply chain, then you need to only save 11%. But I think one insight that Sue likes to point out is that this curve gets steeper as you get closer. And so it may not matter too much to you whether you manufacture in China or Vietnam, because they're both here on this end. But if you can manufacture in Kentucky, you start seeing big savings as you get closer to home. So I think that's it. I'm going to pass it back to Sue.
Great. No, thanks very much. And just to kind of highlight what Ryan has said, that for many industries and many firms, and Professor Trevel's work, this one cost of having a far-flung supply chain is, accounts for somewhere between 20 and 30%. So if your American supplier can offer it to you for $1, if your Chinese supplier is giving it to you for, say, 90 cents, no deal, because this lead time cost is going to dramatically offset it. Let's see, conclude, getting back to, so I just want to conclude and then take questions. There we go. Basically, to conclude where we've been is that to take advantage, we have a historic opportunity to reshore, rebuild U.S. manufacturing, but rebuilding supply chains and particularly helping small manufacturers with their innovative capability is really a crucial thing that we need to do. Small manufacturers face barriers in innovation, commercialization, and diffusion. The market fails to overcome these barriers, and government can help by these 3 methods of diffusing information about what are productive ways to deal with suppliers, for example, what is the true cost of lead time is another example, pump priming in terms of small grants like those that EDA provides for clusters of firms, convening like we want to do with the White House around some of these particularly effective supply chains. And the Department of Commerce plays a key role in each of these areas. And so I'm really looking forward to questions, discussion, et cetera.
Okay, great. And I would just like to remind the in-person audience, if you could ask your question into a mic, that way the virtual audience can hear you also. Any questions in the room to start? In the back.
Hi, I just had a question earlier.
And actually, I guess if you could introduce yourself, that would be great too.
I can do that. Robert Rudnitsky from NIST. So I had a question about, early in the talk you had a slide where you were showing that, forgive me, it was either 59, 61, 62% of the, yes, okay, so right. So that, going to the left side, where we're talking about 54% of the costs of distribution of, 54% of the manufacturing costs come from materials. Can you say anything about whether there's whether and what the labor component is of those further upstream costs of the materials themselves?
Oh, it's it's turtles all the way down, as they say. So there's obviously labor that goes into making this material. So if you think about autos, where I do most of my research, so you think there's an automotive seat. To make that seat that's provided to Ford, there's going to be workers there. But the point of this, I think, is in terms of the interfaces that a company has. So if you're a plant manager, there's a lot of focus on reducing your direct labor, but you may be doing different things in terms of interacting with your suppliers, and that these activities are maybe underemphasized. So the sort of value analysis to cut out a bunch of work that needs to be done to get that material to you would be an example.
I guess in a sense I'm coming at the question from almost the other point of view and saying, I look at your whole talk and I see what looks like a very good argument for trying to increase domestic production. A lot of benefits come to it in terms of American economy, and a part that people care about, of course, is increasing the number of people who are working. And so trying to get at, so all of these upstream costs, if they were overseas, would go to the benefit of whatever country they were in. Having them here brings the benefit here. So if I could get at something about the number of people who would be working to produce those what look here as upstream costs, right, that strengthens the argument for American production.
Yes, no, I agree with that. Yeah, yeah.
And we just had a quick related question as to, on this particular slide, what the other represented.
Do you remember, Brian?
So the other is I'm disobeying the rules. So the other is sort of, it's a residual. The way the economic census collects data from manufacturers is it asks them the value of their shipments, and then it asks them for various inputs. And so the other will be, sometimes it will be inputs that are not listed here, which of course I'm struggling to think of off the top of my head. But some of that will also be sort of value added. The value of your shipments is over and above the total cost of your inputs, obviously,
so
because you need to make a profit. So that will also be included in the other. But I couldn't say what percentage it is.
And then you, sir?
Mark Crawford with BIS. So your use of the label materials really includes semi-finished and finished components.
Yes, we're using the terms they use in the economic census.
Okay, great. I think we've got one right behind you. We'll just pass it on back.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
you
go
got the
ahead,
mic.
Leah Liston from General Counsel's Office. I have a question about when government is thinking about focusing on areas to speed up the supply chain or make the supply chain more efficient. What is the breakdown between making small suppliers more efficient and the bricks and mortar type of supply chain efficiency, like improving infrastructure to help goods, the movement side of the equation?
Both are important. Yeah, I mean, I think we haven't broken it down separately. I think that both things are important. I guess I would also say that this kind of stuff that I'm talking about is actually quite cheap compared to infrastructure. So we're talking about having some convening, having people talk to each other. There's a similar initiative that I also worked on with the White House around supplier pay, basically speeding payment to suppliers. And basically what that did was convene a group of about 50 large OEMs that are talking together about how they can do that to basically reduce working capital needs of their suppliers. So the cost of that to the White House was, a couple months of staff time. So I think these are very, very cheap things with a pretty high rate of return. And obviously I think they'll interact with infrastructure investment. So if we can reduce the kind of lead time that Ryan was talking about by improving transportation within the country, between the country and elsewhere, that those will have complementary synergistic benefits.
Great. You, sir?
I'm David Beatty. I'm with the Office of Chief Economist. I was just wondering about this slide, whether it focuses on data from manufacturing establishments, or does it also include data on auxiliary establishments like R&D establishments or headquarters or sales offices and that kind of thing?
I'm pretty sure it's manufacturing establishments. Yeah, I mean, David raises a really good point, and there's a whole set of efforts that we're working on separately around a data system that would be appropriate for this kind of new economy that we have. And so one of the things that was done in NAICS was to separate out R&D and sales offices from factories. So General Motors Technical Center in Warren is not included in this data, and the workers there are not included as manufacturers.
Jack Cobb from EDA. I was wondering if you found any common barriers to repatriating a supply chain. The benefits seem significant. I was wondering if you found any reasons that it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, this ecosystem that we talk about, that there was incredible decline so the U.S., if we think about manufacturing employment in the U.S., it's been between about 15 million people and about 17 million people since the 1960s. So from 1960 to 2000, we had a pretty similar amount of manufacturing employment. We lost a third of those jobs between 2000 and 2010. And so what happened then was a lot of the manufacturing ecosystem declined. So what does that mean? It means that if you used to, if you were, say, in Cleveland, you had a choice of 50 tool and die shops you could design tooling for you, and they could specialize in tooling for electronic parts, tooling for big parts, tooling for small parts. Now you may have 2 of those, or you may not be able to get that part at all. Walmart has been trying to bring some things back, and one of the things they've identified is small motors. So I think that's a kind of an issue, and then the kind of building back, I think we saw with this Itron example of, if one company can take a lead, then there can be benefits that are spread across the whole chain. So I think one issue is, rebuilding the capabilities that we once had. I think that's a first issue. A second is developing new capabilities that really should take advantage of our general advantage of innovation. So the kind of innovations pioneered by Toyota around they're called Kaizen in Japanese, continuous improvement. So the quality circles, the preventive maintenance. If we can diffuse those will give us a big advantage in producing here, I think. So those 2 things would be what I'd point to.
I'm going to ask a couple WebEx questions that sort of fit together. Susan H. asked, if most of the manufacturing facilities are in other nations, how can American suppliers compete with suppliers located closer to the plants? And then Robert Brown asked sort of a related but unrelated question. What constitutes made in the USA now, especially when the product uses global supply chain?
Okay. So I would recommend that everyone read this report that Ryan and Jessica wrote called What is Made in America? That goes through various definitions, and it's really a great report with a lot of great stuff. It's on our website. So I think to start from backwards, if you think about all manufactured goods consumed in the US, so that would include say this suit imported from China. It would include these bookcases probably made in the US. It would include a Toyota maybe assembled in the US but with parts coming from all over the world. If we think about all that stuff all together, 51% of the value actually comes from the US. We don't see it as consumers because a lot of what we make is goods that are used in the production of consumer goods. So turbines that GE would make, for example. We don't see that in this room. If you then, so we have 51% of stuff that's consumed in the US. If you then look just at output where the final good is made in the US, so let's say a Toyota assembled in Kentucky, on average, 79% of the inputs of that would be American, which again is maybe higher than people think because we think so much about consumer goods. Very little apparel is made in the US, but if it is made in the US, the percentage that's domestic content is actually quite high, is 70 or 80%.
Yeah, hi, Joe Bailey from the PTO. I wanted to see if, with the changes that are happening here in terms of the supply chain, in terms of firms and firm relationships, what impact it has on agility or firms and supply chain's ability to move with exogenous forces.
I'm sorry, the impact of which changes?
All the changes in terms of firm relationships, moving kind of from hierarchies more to markets and so on. What impact it has in a more dynamic context?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually I think of agility in the opposite way, as this huge opportunity for American companies. I mean, I think one of the things, because American suppliers are close to the point of demand, the lead time is less, and that's quite valuable, as Ryan showed. So I talked to a lot of a company that makes large fasteners, and they would basically set the price based on how desperate they sounded on the phone. But agility is not easy, and to get there requires a really complicated set of investments that cross over across marketing, IT, operations, and labor. And so it's not easy for small firms to get there. So if you think about it, there's a great study of valve producers. If you can provide next day service, there's huge benefit to the whole supply chain. But to get there, you need workers who can set up the equipment as well as change over. I'm sorry, as well as just watch it. So we often want to have, we think, oh, well, it's dumb to be paying somebody a high wage just to watch a machine, but we forget about the value of flexibility. And if that person sometimes may be spending a lot of time just watching a machine, but if that person then can also switch over when it's needed, that's beneficial. But then you need to have invested in the equipment that's easy to switch over. And you need to have a marketing capability that says to the world, hey, I can do this. You need an IT capability that can link that marketing capability so that the person can order directly to the shop floor and schedule that way. So there's this real mix that's really complicated for American firms of a technological know-how and some investment in physical equipment that's needed, but then also in shop floor. I actually had an example here. In shop floor skills and empowerment, you need all those things, and it's really hard. A lot of these small firms, with 40, 50 people, there's one manager, who's the owner, who's good in either finance or marketing, maybe that one. You have one set like that, and then another set that can do engineering, but rarely do you have somebody with both skills. So I think this is a real lack. There's an MIT study that talks about how American small firms are home alone, in contrast to, say, German or Japanese firms, where there's a whole network of institutions that help them find skilled labor, that help them with commercialization of products, that help them keep up with R&D. And this is sort of one of the things, I guess, that we're trying to build. So a long answer to your question, I'm not sure.
Okay, Jay, do you have a mic?
Sue, hi, Jason Bolton. I'm with the Bureau of Industry and Security. Two-part question concerning R&D tax credits. One, does the department have a position on R&D tax credits? Two, to what extent are any of your models informed by actual R&D tax credit data rather than self-reported R&D data?
Oh, that's a great point. So the data that we reported, I believe, actually comes from NSF. So that's self-reported, but that's a great idea that we could actually, if we could get that data, we could look at that. That would be very interesting. On the data side. In terms of the policy side, I believe the department is in favor of maintaining it. I think there's a plus and minus. So one is we often think of tax credits as kind of free, but $1 less of expenditure, or $1 more tax expenditure is $1 less we have to spend on other things. And so one of the things to think about, as we think about policy is, are we giving that dollar, say, to GE to spend on its own operations, or would we like to take that dollar and add it to the budget of the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation so that we could build the cluster? and build. So I think that these are tough questions, and the answer is probably some of both, but again, the mix is hard to get.
I just wanted to, with relation to the clusters, someone asked, have you looked at Michael Porter's recent cluster analysis based on the NAICS codes data? And how does that relate to the Supply Chain Innovation Initiative? Is there an active effort to influence these cluster formations to optimize supply chain costs?
Yes.
Great.
So EDA has actually partnered with Michael Porter on to create, and there's a whole cluster website that he's developed. So one of the things that you can always cut up the world in different ways, and I think both ways are important. So one is to think in terms of relationships between particular customers and suppliers making the same product. So all the way, from the seats and steering wheels, et cetera, that go into a automobile, and that's what's been the cut that I've taken in this talk. But it's also important to recognize that often there are regional specializations, and so even though we have the internet and everything, regions tend to specialize in a particular kind of manufacturing. So the West Coast in aerospace, Illinois, et cetera, in agricultural equipment. And it makes a lot of sense to strengthen those, and they suffer. I mentioned this free rider problem. The clusters, everybody benefits from the information flow and the access to skilled labor and the access to specialized input that you get in a cluster. But because no one firm gets the return to all that, there's markets alone you'll have underinvestment. So we have a number of policies that we've worked on that promote those. And so I see these as highly complementary. Yeah.
Great. Another in-house?
Yeah, Dr. Helper, it's Jude Mazzata with the Office of Public Affairs and International Trade Administration. I would say 90% of the people I talk to on a daily basis are small business owners trying to look to export. So when I read data, when I read this report you all published when I came to this, I see small businesses being identified as something less than 500 employees. And the people I speak to every day, their small business is probably 25 or less employees. So the question I have is, why? I guess why is that? Why are we looking at data at only 500 and not maybe breaking that down more?
So this is the SBA definition, is 500 or less. And yeah, I think there's a big difference in terms of capability between a firm with 25 employees and a firm with 500. So I agree with you. We need to invest more in our data. And actually there's another initiative that we're also working on in my office around making sure that our data talks about the economy we actually have, which has a lot of these small firms, a lot of disaggregated supply chains that are really tough to tease out of the data, and we want to fix that. So it's a helpful comment.
Okay, great. Anyone else in the room? Chris?
Will 3D, Chris Heflin from, who am I from? Performance Shop. Will 3D manufacturing, what do they call it, additive, be a disruptive element here where one can customize so easily and maybe could do it on their own?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different things that might happen. There's, I guess I have two things. So one is if we look at this, look at the economy in say 30, 40 years, it may look totally different. It's not going to look totally different tomorrow. I think it's, what we can 3D print now are cool little plastic things that typically don't have to bear a lot of stress or a lot of wide variations in temperature. That's coming, and there's a lot of research going on at NIST and at the National Network of Manufacturing Institute in Youngstown, Ohio on these things. So it's not going to be overnight, but I think what it offers the promise of, or the possibility, is potentially sort of much more local manufacturing, where you could go in and have the local cobbler and you decide, gee, hey, this is what I want my shoe to look like, and then it's 3D printed out. So I think 3D printing is not one thing. There's a whole variety of equipment, a whole variety of processes, and a whole variety of materials that would be needed to develop before it really plays out. But I think it's a very exciting thing that will play out over decades.
Elizabeth Schaefer with the International Trade Administration. Quick question about, I know this discussion around factoryless goods producers. So how do you think that this fragmentation of production processes over time that we've seen not only in manufacturing, but let's say you used to have an in-house engineer, now that engineer is a completely independent entity that might not be captured in the manufacturing data. To what degree do you think that influences the overall statistics that we look at as a whole of government when we see manufacturing employment? What's your gut check or gut sense on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important issue. And I think that the initiative around factoryless goods production was a useful initiative, but there's always trade-offs you make in the data. And so the current data was basically set up sort of for Ford, where Ford, everything that's in the autos is sort of controlled by the old River Rouge type thing. The factoryless goods issues, so what's happening is we're seeing a lot of unbundling, and it's being done in different ways. So it's not just that people say do design only and not production. They may do contract manufacturing. They may do both design and production, but outsource the finance and even some of the logistics part. And so I think understanding all that's really important. It's also important, though, I think, that this unbundling comes with a cost. So there's a bunch of great research. This comes back to the ecosystem point that we thought, I think in the 80s, the 90s, that manufacturing, it's dumb and dirty and dangerous. We don't really need to do that. Well, have Chinese do it, and we'll just do the innovation. And what happens when you lose the production is you lose a lot of ideas that would help you. What could this technology do that we haven't thought of? You have to understand how it works in the factory. What happens when you try to stress it? And we've been losing that. So first we offshored little components for computers, and then the entire assembly, and now the design is almost entirely offshore as well, and the R&D. So it's a slippery slope. And then similarly, big companies thought, we don't care if our small companies have engineers or not. We'll just tell them what to do. But there's a huge amount of benefit to having an engineer that's every day looking at the equipment, ideally talking to the person who operates that equipment, and you can make changes on the fly, et cetera. So I think one of the things we need to understand better is, when do you want to specialize? What forms of collaboration across functions are important, and when do you want them in the same firm and when not? So a lot of issues, and our data does a good job of capturing it, and we're working on it.
Great. Anyone else in the room at the moment? All right, I've got a couple virtual questions. When calculating and this may be more for Ryan, I'm not sure. When calculating the full costs of importing materials from foreign suppliers, does the ACE tool record the costs that domestic companies pay their foreign suppliers? Does the website keep any information used in the calculations?
So there are a couple answers. So the answer to the actual question is no. But the reason why the answer is no is that ACE is not primarily designed as a calculator. ACE is more of a cognitive framing tool, I would say, in the sense that it's a list of sort of things to think about, and there are sort of there are data points in there. If you go through each of those pages, you'll see that we've done some work to provide charts and data and data sources that can be used to understand these concepts. There are other organizations that provide calculators that are well positioned to do that. The NIST MEP in particular has been very good about working on this. They've designed a calculator. They give workshops to small businesses, and they sort of operate on the front lines and are much better at that than I think we are. And so, so that's the long answer to that question.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Next question, did materials input get more expensive, or is the percentage increase due to the percentage decrease in pay to labor that happened in the same period? I think she was referring to the domestic content slide.
Let's see, I think, well, so I guess there's two questions embedded in that. One is just in terms of the material costs, how much of it is that you're buying fewer tons of steel, or buying more tons of steel versus the price of steel rose. And I think we can't answer that because Census asked for its data only in dollars, so we don't know how many tons of steel that bought.
Right.
And then I guess in terms of the relationship between material cost and labor cost, boy, my brain hurts. That's a really great question I will think about. But I guess I think that's right, that to the extent that we've seen wage stagnation, and we've also seen that since the 80s, workers have not been capturing very much of productivity gains, and that's going to be reflected in those cost charts.
Okay.
So,
great. And then manufacturers require different skills than other industries, such as service industries. Many of the most useful skills for manufacturing skills, like mechanical skills, welding, how to use a wrench, are not taught in high school or colleges. What is the Department of Commerce doing to increase the pool of workers who have the necessary skills to work in manufacturing?
Oh, wow. This is a passion of the secretaries. I think we're doing a lot of things around, I guess I think there's two kinds of things, that one of which is to actually increase the supply, and there we're working very closely with the president, has announced a huge initiative around apprenticeship and also around community colleges. And since we're the voice of business, we're working with business to help them understand the value of investments in training, and also to make sure that those investments are useful and well targeted. The second thing that I think we're doing, also doing stuff on, is linkages. It's tempting to say, and you hear it all the time, that there's a skill shortage. For an economist, you'd see a skill shortage if there was rising wages. In very few occupations, in very few places do you see that. And so part of the problem is that there are people out there, and they aren't, either we haven't been funneling them in, welders who aren't helped by our unemployment offices to find new jobs in welding, and or employers that simply want the Cadillac for the Chevrolet price. And so I think on both these fronts, our data initiative is doing a lot, working with companies like Burning Glass around trying to figure out more specifically where are openings, who's got skills, and how do we make that linkage work better.
Great. Anyone else in the room? No? Okay, I have one final WebEx question. How do you account for overlap of costs between categories of costs of a manufactured product, i.e. a product obtained with lower raw materials cost, but is in a cruder form and takes longer to greater safety controls to handle it? And where do these increased costs of lowering raw materials fit? I.e., what category does complying with government regulations fit? That was a mouthful.
So I guess that question could be asking about two things. So one would be on the data front, and the other would be on the purchasing policy front.
I think so.
So on the data front, Census asks firms, and so it's however they treat it. On the purchasing policy front, I think these are crucial kinds of decisions that we want to highlight that are made, and that sometimes trade-offs are not made as well as they might be. Increasingly, firms are teaming engineers and purchasing people together so that some of these trade-offs can be made in a smarter way, and you don't end up doing things that are penny-wise and pound-foolish,
Right.
and we want to help that.
And then a follow-up to the previous question from the same person. Is the skill shortage not resulting in increased wages in manufacturing because the small manufacturing companies can't afford to pay the increased wages?
Well, this again, I think, comes down to accounting issue. You know, how much is it really costing you to keep that job open for a year? You know, if basically you're unwilling to raise the wage by a few cents or try experimenting, paying a little bit higher, and so you keep the job open, you know, that's costly too. You may be turning away business. So I think manufacturers really need to understand that, and they also, I think, need to understand that often when you pay more, you also get a better worker, and so maybe your material costs are going to fall. So I think it's a real call for managers to not sort of focus on, you know, minimizing their wage bill. That's not what, you know, they might do. That might be more productive to think about maximizing profits, and that includes perhaps paying more for labor, just as I'm talking about paying more for suppliers. So I think experimenting on some of these things may actually yield some solutions.
Great. And it looks like that's all the WebEx. One last call. Questions in the room? Anyone? All right. Well, thank you so much. This was fabulous. We really appreciate you coming.
Thanks a lot.